Good morning. Thank you all for coming to this, the latest in a series of lectures by the curatorial staff here at the Honolulu Museum of Art. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you today. We have a number of distinguished visitors in the audience today, including my predecessor, Ms. Sawako Chang. Welcome. I believe that many of you know me, but I go by many names here at the museum, so let me introduce myself again for the record. I'm Stephen Salel, and I'm the Robert F. Lange Foundation Research Associate for Japanese Art. Much of the research that I do here at the museum revolves around Japanese Shunga, that is, Japanese erotica. And the exhibition that I'd like to offer a preview of today is called Arts of the Bedchamber. We've just launched the website for the exhibition. This is a rather large multimedia website. It contains all the imagery and discursive text found in the exhibition, as well as 5 podcasts. I think the site has the potential to be a particularly effective tool for docents who would like to study the material. The website has been adapted for mobile devices as well, so you can listen to the podcasts and read the labels while you're in the gallery or elsewhere. The podcasts were narrated by our director, Stefan Jost, Sati Bennis-Chalk, the Asian Art Department Manager, Kristen Remington, the Asian Art Department Intern, and Dietra Cordia, one of our fabulous docents. Jared Stone oversaw the design of the site, Ukiyo-e Minami, Sachio Kawaiea, Yumiko Glover, and Keiko Kanko helped immensely with research. Sean Eichmann and Sati Bennis-Chalk helped with editing the text. Scott Kubo provided all of the photography and much technical guidance. And Lisa Griffith, Clark Riley, Chris Garfani, and Stefan were invaluable in helping in their guidance as we as a museum develop a stronger presence on the internet. Let me also take a moment to thank Susan Thomas, our Asian art print technician, our designer Jared Stone, Larry Maria, and the entire installation crew as they prepare for the exhibition, which opens on November 23rd in Gallery 14. Thank you all so much. Like the Shunga exhibition and its website, this lecture deals with subject matter that is potentially disturbing and offensive, and it is not intended for a general audience. In particular, it is not intended for listeners below the age of 18. The subjects of age limits and age appropriateness is a tricky one. I'm sure that many of you have heard of this television show, Toddlers and Tiaras. I know you've heard of it because I've heard of it, and I don't even own a television. The show apparently focuses on a group of children between the ages of about 5 and 10 who compete in a beauty pageant the same way that adults might, wearing makeup, spray tans, and costumes. A friend of mine heard about the show and complained, "How can the producers let this little child dress like that? She looks like a woman who's going out on a date. She's not dating. She's not a woman. She's just a child." I agree, and I don't have any interest in ever seeing the show. I'm slightly curious, however, about the way in which my friend worded her criticism, setting up this triangle of factors. Age, she's just a child. Gender, she's not a woman. And sexuality, She's not going out on a date. The show is an undeniable hit, and it's popular because it exposes and exploits the variety of attitudes that people in our society have about the ways in which a person matures, the ways in which that person forms his or her gender identity, and the ways in which a person should be allowed to express his or her sexuality. Though we may agree that age, gender, and sexuality are intrinsically interrelated, unfortunately, we do not all agree about how to draw boundaries around those topics. Let's consider, for example, the age of consent, the age at which our government declares it appropriate for someone to begin having sexual relations. In many states on the mainland, the age of consent is 18. In some states there, however, the age of consent is 16. In the state of Hawaii, the age of consent is 16. Hawaii also has what is known as a close-in age exemption, which states that those between age 14 and 15 are allowed to consent to sex with those less than 5 years older than them. The age of consent varies even more when you consider it from an international perspective. In contemporary Japan, although individual prefectures may have stricter laws, the national government designates the age of consent to be 13. In the Japanese Penal Code, Articles 176 and 177. And of course, if you were to go back 200 years, before the writings of psychologists like Sigmund Freud that clarified the rate at which children psychologically matured, the age of consent in 37 states in the United States was 10. I realize that those facts would horrify any parent nowadays, but they are important for me to mention in the context of this talk. Among the approximately 12,000 Japanese prints in our museum's collection, approximately 350, or 3%, of those prints deal specifically with the issues of age, gender, and sexuality. The way in which we as curators have interpreted these artworks have varied over the years. Let's take a look, for example, at a print by Suzuki Harunobu. In 1994, the eminent scholar Kobayashi Tadashi wrote about this print in the following way, quote, "The 5 cardinal virtues are the 5 moral principles highly esteemed in Confucian philosophy, namely humanity, righteousness, decorum, wisdom, and fidelity." From a series of 5 prints, this sheet, representing righteousness, shows 2 young boys dressed as girls from a homosexual brothel. It underscores the fact that integrity should be maintained even in the world of pederasty. Unquote. It is a rather provocative statement, to say the least, and one that I think demands to be addressed and unpacked. To begin with, let's grapple with the word pederasty, which essentially means sexual child abuse, although its tone is much more dramatic. Let's presume that Kobayashi intended to make a statement about brothel districts such as the Yoshiwara, and to take a moral stance against the Japanese sex industry in general. Actually, Sean and I discuss the destructive aspects of that industry in the Shunga exhibition as well. Regardless, as you all know, images of the Yoshiwara pervade the field of ukiyo-e. So if the leading scholar of Japanese woodblock prints were to take a moral stance against that district and its lifestyle, well, it would be like a militant animal rights activist being the world's specialist in the history of poultry farms. Another possible reason for Kobayashi to use such provocative language, and I think this is far more likely, is that he is discussing what he refers to as a, quote, homosexual brothel, and likely harbors some rather old-fashioned xenophobic attitudes about gay culture. This is the art historical legacy with which we as a museum and as part of the Japanese art historical community have to face in organizing a show about sexuality and Shunga. We've progressed a lot in recent years in developing a more tolerant, positive, healthy attitude about sexuality in all of its various manifestations. And one of my objectives in organizing this exhibition about Shunga is to perpetuate that trend. Kobayashi's statement is based on particular assumptions about age, gender, and sex, and how these topics interrelate. Today I'd like to present an alternative interpretation of images such as this. This explanation is based upon the works of several contemporary scholars, including Joshua Mostow of the University of British Columbia, Paul Gordon Shello of Stanford University, and Aki Ikegami of Ritsumeikan University, who many of you may remember worked here and helped us to catalog the Richard Lane collection. When we look at Japanese woodblock prints and Japanese paintings, sometimes we simply can't determine the gender of the figures depicted. There are numerous reasons for this confusion, but the most fundamental reason is that we tend to confuse the term sex and gender. We often use them interchangeably. In fact, however, the terms have very different meanings. The word sex, as it appears on your driver's license or passport, refers to your anatomy, specifically the shape of your genitalia, whether you have a penis or a vagina. The term gender is much more subjective and complicated. Many of us have heard somewhere or other the idea that gender is a social construct. But what exactly does that mean? It's an idea that was first proposed relatively recently by the phenomenologist Alfred Schutz, who founded the early 20th century what is known as the School of Social Constructionism. Schutz agreed, of course, that one way in which a person's gender is determined is by his or her genitalia. There are other factors as well, however: clothing, hairstyle, body decorations, mannerisms, use of language, sexual proclivities, and sometimes even age. For the time being, suffice it to say that even though the term written on our driver's licenses is sex, the one that's far more important in the development of our social identities is gender. Now, in contemporary American society, often a person's sex and gender are the same. They don't need to be identical, however, and you will occasionally find individuals who are either male or female in terms of their genitalia, but who present themselves either temporarily or over a long term as a member of the opposite gender. One example of this is transvestitism, and we find numerous examples of this in Japanese woodblock prints. In the tattoo exhibition we have on view in Gallery 28, we have shown this print by Utagawa Kunitsuna showing the cross-dressing ruffian Benten Kozo. And here's a print that was recently on view in Zurich featuring a group of women imitating a daimyo's procession down the Tokaido Road between Edo and his home province. Sometimes we're unfamiliar with the context, or we overlook the details that cue us into the fact that these are images of gender bending, but essentially that's the joke behind these images. Now, since gender, unlike sex, is a rather loosely defined concept, it seems reasonable that some societies might acknowledge more than two genders. In fact, even today, some do. Various governments throughout the Indian subcontinent have legally recognized the existence of a third gender known as hijra or kinar. Biologically male individuals whose dress, mannerisms, and other features are different than both men and women. These people often develop sexual relations with masculine men. In Thailand, Kathois, or ladyboys, have gained international attention as a third gender. Here is an image of Nong Tum, perhaps the most internationally recognized Kathoi, for her portrayal in the film Beautiful Boxer, released in the year 2004. In Australia, meanwhile, in order to prevent discrimination against transgender and intersex people, the government has begun to issue passports that list three genders: male, M, female, F, and indeterminate, X. I'm aware of the dangers of comparing phenomena from different cultures and different time periods with one another, but I'm hoping that this brief mention of hijra in India, the Kathois in Thailand, and the legislation in Australia will help you to more easily accept the idea that I want to introduce to you at this time. Let's return to the question of why it's so difficult to determine whether the figures in these artworks are male or female. The reason that I'd like to propose here is because they are neither. These individuals are referred to in Japanese as wakashu, literally young fellows. They appear in Japanese art and literature at least as early as the Heian period, around the year 800, and up until the late Edo period, around 1800. Wakashu were commonly employed as assistants to samurai warriors and as actors on the kabuki stage. A similar group of individuals, known as chigo, could be found in Buddhist monasteries. But in Japanese woodblock prints, wakashu are much more prevalent, so I'll focus on them instead. Wakashu are biologically male individuals whose dress and hairstyles are distinct from both men, adult men, and women. And here I'd like to return to our list of factors other than anatomy that determine a person's gender. In particular, I'd like to focus on the last possible factor I mentioned, age. In pre-modern and early modern Japan, a biological male's maturation was marked at certain stages via ceremonies, like a bar mitzvah. In the intervals between those ceremonies, the individual was expected to assume a particular fashion. At the age of 11 or 12, for example, the crown of his head was shaved, but his forelocks could be left intact. And this marked the beginning of his term as a wakashu. During that time, he would let the hair on the back of his head grow into a ponytail and then fold that ponytail over the top of his head. He would also occasionally cover the shaven area of his head with a brightly colored cap. Sometimes he would be seen wearing a long-sleeved kimono, a furisode. At the age of 18 or 19, the individual's forelocks would be shaven, marking the end of his term as a wakashu and the beginning of his life as an adult man. From that time onward, he would be expected to wear a short-sleeved kimono. Wakashu were hardly relegated to peripheral roles in art and literature. Anyone familiar with otsue, the folk painting that became popular in the area east of Kyoto, may have seen images of a wakashu falconer. This character is considered very auspicious, and I'll be discussing in a print rotation in the Lange gallery over the holidays. This falconer is said to often appear in a person's first dream of the new year. In the tale of Genji, the most famous work of Japanese literature, the main character, Prince Genji, is presented through much of the story as a wakashu. And we see that repeatedly in Japanese prints based on the tale of Genji. Now, I'm sure that many of you realize that the tale of Genji is sort of like a Heian period soap opera and deals with an aristocrat who whiles away his idle time with romantic adventures. Different versions of this story depict his adventures with different degrees of graphic detail, but suffice it to say that Prince Genji is a very sexually active character. It may be surprising and even disconcerting to know that a character between the age of 11 and 19 behaves this way, but keeping in mind the difference in time and culture, it's essentially the same as a young man between the age of 18 and 25 in contemporary America. This reputation for being both sexually adventurous and desirable was shared by most wakashu. In print after print by a variety of artists, we often see a wakashu being spied upon or approached by sexually curious women. I find this print particularly witty, not only as a woman admiring the wakashu, but also she's holding a mirror and the wakashu is admiring himself in the mirror, as if saying to himself, "Hey, who is that sexy beast? Why, that's me! Ha ha ha!" from here, I'm going to begin discussing more graphic imagery. So if necessary, this is the time for anyone who feels uncomfortable with the tone of this lecture to bail out. There is a common social type in the art and literature of Edo, the fan salesman, and this character was essentially an object of sexual desire. Sometimes the fan salesman would be depicted merely standing in the distance, looking rather scrumptious. Other times he would be approached by a potential client. He would visit her home and display his marvelous assortment of paper fans and perhaps recommend some to her. She would choose one that she particularly liked and pay him. He would politely thank her, wish her good day, and depart. This was his routine throughout the day. Not all wakashu were fan salesmen. Some were assistants to samurai warriors. Some were aristocrats like Prince Genji. But they all appear to have been considered very sexually desirable by women. And they often engaged in heterosexual relationships with women. But what's most fascinating about wakashu were the relationships they had with men above the age of 19. Often these relationships were sexual in nature. In Japan, the term for such a relationship is nonshoku, often translated into English as male love. Keep in mind that a wakashu is biologically male. There's a no play about a mysterious stranger who knocks on a poor man's door in the middle of the night in order to seek shelter from the storm. The poor man wants to be a good host and let the stranger warm himself by the fire, but he doesn't have any more wood, so he takes his beloved bonsai tree and chops it up into firewood. The visitor turns out to be a wealthy aristocrat who rewards the poor man handsomely for his sacrifice. This here is a parody of that no play, in which a wakashu visits a poor man's home, and in order to make kindling for his fire, the poor man chops up his beloved flute. Here we see the poor man chopping, and the wakashu looking. I wonder if the wakashu has an assortment of fans that he's going to try to sell this poor man. Wakashu were often employed as musicians, particularly drummers. Here's a wakashu relaxing at home and playing his drum. The inscription on the left says, quote, "A drum is like a dandelion. A little bit of spit on the fingers does the trick." Unquote. It's a curious thing for the artist to write, isn't it? I suppose if your drum starts to fall out of tune, you can moisten the skin of the drum with spittle and make the drum sound better. Is that what the artist means? Well, on one level, yes, but it's important to know that the word for drum is tsutsumi, and the word for dandelion is tsutsumigusa. And it's important to know that a dandelion, in nonshoku parlance, is a symbol of a wakashu's anus. So when you have a portrait of a wakashu relaxing at home, and the inscription on the image talks about moistening your fingers with a bit of saliva, you can probably imagine that this image is talking about more than just making music. Along with fan salesmen, assistants to samurai, and musicians, some wakashu worked as prostitutes. Here's a portrait of one such prostitute holding up a tassel on his obi sash, a signifier of his identity as a wakashu prostitute. The most common place to find wakashu, however, was on the kabuki stage, where they were immensely popular. Reviews of wakashu actors were published in Edo on a regular basis, and in these reviews, the actors were rated on a variety of criteria. How lovely they looked, how sweetly they smiled. Not so much about how well they could act, but rather how well they exuded an aura of sexuality. In that way, these reviews were much like contemporary magazines that fawn over Angelina Jolie or George Clooney. The author Nishizawa Ippu seemed to have found the hypocrisy of these wakashu actor reviews to be unbearable, so he published his own review of these actors, in which he rated them on how well they performed in the bedroom. And the unidentified artist who illustrated Ippu's book was careful to indicate, through the family crests adorning the figure's clothing, exactly which actor he was describing. And though we don't really know if these particular actors actually did have sexual relations with each other, ultimately it didn't really matter, because Ippu's main intent seemed to be to say, look, a huge part of popular culture in Edo is kabuki theater, and a huge reason why kabuki theater is so popular is because the audience is fascinated with these sexy wakashu actors. So let's accept the fact that nonshoku is an aspect of Japanese sexual culture. Or perhaps maybe Ippu just got a kick out of making these actors look like sex-crazed fools. Probably a little bit of both. Now, you'll notice that I discussed nonshoku in a way that didn't use the term homosexuality. Why is it that I'm avoiding the use of that term and preferring instead to describe wakashu as a third gender? If you define homosexuality as sexual relations between two individuals of the same gender, then saying that one of those individuals is of a third gender means that their relationship is, in fact, heterosexual. This is the reason why I describe wakashu as a third gender. Because when a genetically male individual turns 19, his forelocks are shaven off, he stops wearing long-sleeved kimonos, and essentially his gender transforms into that of an adult male. Since homosexuality was not publicly acknowledged until the early 20th century, this new graduate of the wakashu life was required to cease his sexual relations with any and all adult males, regardless of how intense those relations may have been. In the eyes of the wakashu's lover, it's as if the wakashu suddenly died. And so, in Japanese art and literature, you'll often see wakashu compared to cherry blossoms. They only last for a short while. But it is precisely because of their ephemerality that they are considered so beautiful. So, if we now recognize the existence of three genders, that of men, women, and wakashu, then let's revisit the topic of cross-dressing as it appears in Japanese prints. Here we have a print depicting a young woman dressed up as a wakashu, and the inscription says, quote, "Oh, how cute she looks, masquerading as a fellow. During the 18th century, the predecessors of geisha, a group of female dancers called odoriko, began to engage in prostitution. They found a particularly successful way in which to generate business was to dress as wakashu. That way, they could appeal to both men who liked women as well as men who liked wakashu. So now that we've discussed the rather complicated ways in which the factors of age, gender, and sex were combined to define an individual in Edo society, let's return to that print by Suzuki Harunobu that the scholar Kobayashi described in such harsh terms. The print recently traveled to Zurich and was featured in the Rietberg Museum's exhibition, The Beauty of the Moment, a version of which we will be exhibiting here next year. The curator of the Rietberg Museum described the print in the following way. The term bijin was not limited to courtesans of the pleasure quarters, but could refer to housewives and young men as well. In Harunobu's design, two male prostitutes sit looking at woodblock prints by candlelight. Their slight physiques and delicate features make their sex difficult to determine, but their tasseled obi identify them as young men." Unquote. In other words, these are wakashu, distinct in gender from adult men, and distinguished by their hairstyles and clothing, who have hidden their hairstyle and instead assumed the hairstyle of a woman in order to work in an environment usually associated with female courtesans. Just as in the previous image, where we saw a woman assuming the guise of a wakashu in order to survive in the sex industry, here we have wakashu dressed as women in order to do the same thing. People may harbor various feelings about Japanese erotica and its art historical importance, and that's fine. But for me, I'm happy to say that, thanks to our research into the genre of Shunga, we are finally understanding the complexity of pre-modern and early modern Japanese society. Thank you very much for your time.